I've mentioned before on this channel just how excruciating the first couple of weeks and months of grad school can be. It's a little bit different from being an undergrad because you spend so much less time on campus and everybody has other things going on, and you're a little bit older, so while everybody that you know is off at their first full-time job, you are back in school, so you kind of have this feeling that you are not in step with most of the other people that you knew before. And if you move to a new city, then you've got to deal with all of those problems too, which again is a little bit different from undergrad, because whereas you have undergraduate programs in every large town, in my case there were 24 programs across the country, and I applied to one in Rhode Island and one in Washington, D.C. I don't like large states. But the sense of imposter syndrome when you're there, I mean, being in grad school and feeling like everyone around you is smarter than you and deserves to be there more than you, and it doesn't even matter that that's not the case, it's how you feel. So in week 1 or week 2, I was at this coffee hour, and I didn't know anybody. I was talking to people that the only thing I knew about them was that they also liked history. So we were all trying to flounder for ideas to talk about, whether it's history or pop culture or whatever. We're trying to feel each other out, trying to get a beat on what other people will talk about, what our common interests are. Are they as scary as you imagine grad students to be? No. And I remember thinking to myself, in much less self-aware terms, you know, there was a lot of good history in 1776. I'm just gonna say some of those plot beats as if they're facts. And that was one of the most embarrassing things I've ever done. So I'd seen this play a couple of years before when I was a junior in college, and I loved it. It was one of the reasons why I watched the John Adams miniseries, which is one of my favorite historical films. And it's the reason why I wanted to stop and see Montiero on my road trip home from school, and it has nothing to do with the fact that there's an electric car supercharger in Charlottesville. There are 2 points to this story. First, 1776 is hokey, inaccurate. There's a whole song about how good Thomas Jefferson is, but it also inspired me to go and learn some real history. Not grad school in general, I was going to do that anyway, but specifically that documentary and that historic site. It did help me memorize statues of the Capitol. That is the other thing it was good for. Until I did that legwork, and I don't think that everybody would. In fact, I know that not everybody would. Until I did that legwork, I didn't know what was fact and what was embellished. And because it's so hard to tell, and because people don't do the legwork, that's why I'm making this video, and that's why so many historians have spilled so much ink about Hamilton the musical. Before I get too far into all of this, I should probably mention that I have not, at time of recording, watched Hamilton the musical. I was supposed to in August. We all know what happened there. So my research for this video comes from a trick that I learned in grad school. Read the footnotes, read the reviews. But if and when I hit 100 subscribers, I will write my own scholarly opinion review of Hamilton the musical. So if you like what I do and you want more content, make sure that you subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and make sure to share my video around. Get more eyes on it, get more subscribers in here, and I'll do the review. And until that happens in 2023, I have a short list of other historical topics, including other popular, problematic historical fiction topics to cover, so hit the notification bell and let's get to it. Timothy Stanley has to say, in his marvelous book about the play, which details the musical allusions to the classical rap and Broadway show tunes, Miranda brags about the production's faithfulness to history, challenging historians to take this seriously. A great many historians, most of whom are protective of historical precision, have taken the challenge, not only writing about the accuracy of the play, but even organizing panels at conferences. Most of the problematic parts, from my perspective, arise out of interpretation rather than factual error. And, of course, artists have every right to interpret history to create plays, films, novels, and the like. Did you catch that? He moved the goalposts. First, Miranda says that he wants this to be taken seriously by historians and to enter it as a piece into the historiographical conversation. But then second, Stanley says, no guys, don't hold him to that high of a standard, he's just an artist. And the thing is, you can write historical fiction with historical characters in it. But if we were going to hold him to fictional standards, then no historian would be writing this much about it. So let's hold him to historical standards. And of course, all history is interpretation. You don't look at an archive and just say, we're done. In fact, you also don't look at the total sum of everybody's receipts, letters, deeds, whatever, and say, oh, it's all going in the archive. That's not the case either. There's curation and there's weeding at every single level. And when you write a history, you do pick and choose, and you do interpret, and you do write the here's why this matters in the year of our Lord 2021. And the interpretive aspect only gets more interpreting when you get into the public history realm of things. When you're at a museum or a historic site, you're dealing with people who aren't other scholars, so you have to make things accessible. You have to use metaphors, you have to use reenacting, you have to show them, and that's all interpretation. And there are lots of conversations about how do you have people be costume interpreters, and there are situations where people do it really badly, and there are situations where people take the wrong messages, and these are scrutinized, and then as historians, we do better the next time. This is a process where we as professional historians work really hard to try and communicate complex academic ideas to the general public in a way that they would want to in their spare time for fun, like nerds. So if Miranda wants to join the conversation, I say let him, and most historians say let him. And to be fair, Stanley doesn't let him off so easy. Miranda leans too heavily, sometimes almost exclusively, on the biography of Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow, a very traditional account that occasionally verges on hagiography. I had to look that up, that's nerd for writing about saints. Ron Chernow's account is part of the great man theory of history. During the past decades, scholars and teachers have adopted different approaches to help us understand the vast array of actors and actresses that participated in fashioning American history. How do I say this? Biography isn't history. Historians can be a little protective over what is history, and I say that the two most contentious categories are documentary and biography. Let me give you an analogy because I think that people tend to be more scientifically literate than they are historically literate. When I was in elementary school, we had this separate classroom that was the science room, and it was full of rocks and snakes and globes and stuff like that. So one time in, I want to say 3rd or 4th grade, we went in and the teacher asked us, what is science? And we start listing off all of these things that are tangential. The snakes, the rocks, the animals, the this, the that, the air, the clouds, the particles, whatever. And one kid says, oh, well, everything is science, because atoms are science, and this shirt, it's made of atoms, so my shirt is science. And you probably just caught our mistake in listing off things that were related to the discipline rather than defining the discipline itself. Science is a method of inquiry where you start disproving the things that you think might be true, and if you can't disprove it, then you know it's true. It's not just all the stuff associated with it. And history is the same way. It's a deep dive, it's a study, it's an academic discipline. And of course biography is going to play its part in history. We need case studies, we need microhistories. But these things aren't the same as biography because they dig a little bit deeper and they look at the things that are going on below the surface. Thomas Flynn has a great way of putting this. Look at me, I read real books. If the new history is history without people, it is also history without heroes and villains. As another prominent French historian remarked, unlike the old history with its emphasis on narrating the drama of human choice, the new history focuses primarily on what underlies those choices, on what determines them, and makes them inevitable despite the appearance of freedom. That was Francois Furet in The Workshop of History, translated by Jonathan Mendelbaum. So while case studies are important, they're important to understanding what's going on below the surface. We've all seen this picture of the iceberg before, where the top part is what's visible, and then what's going on below the surface is like 90% of it. And the part on top is all the historical traces. These are your archives, your archaeology, material culture, oral history, all of these different pieces of evidence that you can use to then figure out what's going on down here. And what's going on down here might not be fully evident, but it's just as important, because otherwise you wouldn't have the result that we can see. And the thing about an iceberg, just like the thing about history, is if it had rotated, if we had a different 10% on top, it would be the same iceberg and we'd have the same amount of information, and we'd be just working with different scraps and traces to try and piece together the whole picture. But if our view of it is correct, then if we have new information, if something new arises, then we get to incorporate it into our larger working theory. If we're wrong and we find new information, then we have to adjust everything. We have to have a big paradigm shift. And good histories move us towards a more accurate view of the past, whereas bad histories either sideline the conversation or obscure the conversation that we're having. Or if they're really bad, they can move us backwards to an old way of knowing. So the thing is, I haven't read Ron Chernow's book either, and I'm not gonna. I'm currently in grad school, and I don't have the gobs of hours I would need in order to actually finish that book. And I really want to make this video. Maybe if I get 1,000 subscribers, I'll read it. That said, I have read other books by him, so I have an idea of his authorial voice. Follow me on Instagram for book reviews. And cats. I also know someone who's read this book in particular, and their comments have given me some insight too. So this first review I found isn't really that helpful, but it is funny and I want to share it with you. John Masha writes, "Not that Alexander Hamilton is an easy meal to digest. He was a genius whose conceptual thinking outdistanced by leagues that of Virginia farmers and Massachusetts prudes, and whose notions of structure and finance surpassed their comprehension. Hamilton's brilliance was matched by his iron will, readiness for confrontation and combat, and a determination that enabled him to escape from Nevis and the islands, nests of brutal slavery, prostitution, miscegenation, betrayal, and bankruptcy." I'm sorry, what? Miscegenation is on the same tier as betrayal and slavery? When was this guy? So this guy was born in 1935 and he died in 2012, but we're dealing with people from 2004, 2005, and they think a little bit differently than we do now. So whatever they have to say is as much a product of their time as it is a reflection of this book. For example, one review that I'm actually going to use a little bit later on reads, "Chernow is not so adept in his handling of Hamilton's other intimate relationships. Although hedging his claim in a variety of ways, Chernow coyly hints that Hamilton and John Laurens, Hamilton's closest friend during the war years, might have been lovers, a suggestion that reveals Chernow's uncertain grasp of the 18th century. During an era that prized sensibility as a key attribute of manliness, displays of affection among men, including frequent recourse to tear, which is the very opposite of manliness today, were commonplace, and Hamilton's sometimes overheated letters to Laurens are a reflection of social and literary conventions, not a signpost of possible homosexuality." Now I have a few things to say about that. First, there have always been, and there always will be, a variety of human sexual and romantic orientations. One of the things that makes queer history so difficult, and also interesting and rewarding and insightful, is the fact that these categories change over time. This is called post-structuralism, and it's basically the idea that you have to let go of certain modern categories if you want to understand how people understood themselves in the past. So to take this as an example, what we see as possible bisexuality in Hamilton can't really be categorized as bisexuality. It's evidence that queer orientations have always existed, but it's not bisexuality as we understand bisexuality because we didn't have that word for human behavior yet. Back then, bisexuality was a way to describe plants. It's a little bit like how a couple of years ago people would harangue asexual people. Oh, do you think you're gonna split in two? Obviously not. Obviously, we're taking a word and we're changing the meaning. And with social categories changing over time, Hamilton wouldn't have seen himself that way. Even if he was romantically or sexually interested in John Lawrence, even if he acted on it, he still probably wouldn't have seen himself as identifying with that characteristic. And that's something else we see change over time. What we see now as an immutable characteristic of the self, people used to see as a behavior that people did. At the same time, that doesn't preclude gay people from 2004 or 2015 or 2021 from looking to the past and saying, we've always been here. The only thing it says is that we shouldn't look to the past and say, that is a bisexual man, because bisexuality as we understand it today didn't exist as a social category for people to identify with. Second, a lot of the stuff that I just said wasn't really on people's radars in 2004, 2005 when these reviews were being written. I mean, gay marriage wasn't even legal in 49 states, and people did not want it to spread. It actually makes it all the more interesting and heartening and nice that Ron Chernow would put this in his book, and I like that. And on a personal note, back in high school, I was a young gay nerd history buff. Shocking, I know. Back then, I was having a tough time with all of this stuff, and it honestly meant the world to me to hear cold in my professions and warm in my friendship. I wish, my dear Lawrence, it might be in my power by action rather than words to convince you that I love you. I shall only tell you that till you bade us adieu, I hardly knew the value you had taught my heart to set upon you. Indeed, my friend, it was not well done. You know the opinion I entertain of mankind, and how much it is my desire to preserve myself free from particular attachments, and to keep my happiness independent on the caprice of others. You should not have taken advantage of my sensibility to steal my affections without my consent, but as you have done it, and as we are generally indulgent to those we love, I shall not scruple to pardon the fraud you've committed, on condition that for my sake, if not for your own, you will always continue to merit the partiality which you have so artfully instilled in me. It's such a little thing, but it meant the world to me. It was precious, and in 2011 it was mine. Okay, on to the next review. J. Freeman writes, Chernow, who has previously written biographies of J.P. Morgan and John D. Rockefeller, acknowledges Hamilton's arrogance, his bouts of self-pity, and his penchant for cynical manipulation. But this self-made man was capable of great compassion and was consistently outraged by the institution of slavery. Although his understanding of human limitations made him suspicious of unrestrained democracy, his devotion to individual liberty did not falter. So what I'm getting from this review is that Ron Chernow knows how to create a protagonist with enough great accomplishments that we view him in great esteem, but has enough character flaws that we feel like he's a relatable human being. This is all what I expect based on Chernow's style, but this next review says something very telling. Right? Robert Flatley writes, lastly, he was philosophically and morally opposed to dueling, and that's how he met his end. So, Ron Chernow does this thing where he starts with all of the data, all of the information you could possibly want, which is how you should start your historical research. But then he takes that information and he narrativizes a hero based on this historical figure. And this is a problem because people don't live their lives in a convenient 3-act structure. You know, in order to have a hero, you have to have certain problems for them to overcome internally, externally, great accomplishments, whatever. People don't live their lives that way. This is storytelling. It's compelling storytelling. I have enjoyed his work before. It's not the best histories, and here is where you start to see the problems. When you narrativize someone's life, opposed to just cataloging it, you end up with inconsistencies. Now, I'm not saying that Ron Chernow massages data or anything so overt. What I am saying is that he tends to take a narrative, and any piece of data that falls outside of that narrative, he will either dismiss it or say it's a one-off thing. He doesn't attribute it to the person's character. I first noticed this when I was reading Grant. Now, throughout Grant's career, drinking was a problem for him to different extents, at different times. Sometimes it was a problem because it was a problem for him. Sometimes other people made it a problem for him, either by slandering him or by exposing his drinking, or however you want to look at it. A lot of this is he said, and you just don't know. But what Ron Chernow does is he narrativizes, like, Grant would drink when he had these specific stressors and these specific instances. And then anything that falls out of this narrative, he dismisses as, oh, that was gossip, oh, that was hearsay, someone was slandering him, someone was trying to drag his reputation. It couldn't have been the case. And I don't really see any stronger or weaker evidence that this secondary pattern of behavior wasn't also true. I'm not saying that it also wasn't false. I don't know. And more importantly, Ron Chernow doesn't know either. And so when he makes these broad claims like, lastly, he was philosophically and morally opposed to dueling, and yet that's how he met his end, I start to wonder, was he really philosophically and morally opposed to dueling? Or maybe this changed over time. You know, a great example of someone changing their mind is, did you know that Maximilien Robespierre used to be against the death penalty? So when I hear stuff like this, my little alarms go off. Another example of this can be seen in how Chernow characterizes Hamilton's marriage. Andrew Trees writes, Trees is the same historian who said that Hamilton couldn't be bisexual. One of the best aspects of Chernow's book is his description of the marriage and of Hamilton's family life. A sensitive portrait revealing a devoted family man and a wife every bit as strong and determined as her husband. Although I found myself wondering if this depiction owed something to our modern time, especially when considering that Hamilton was hardly a model of fidelity. So he's a great family man, but he also had 2 affairs. I'm sorry, what? This is what happens when you characterize somebody, and that characterization doesn't encompass the full range of human actions that this person took. It's also telling that the writing and the research were so strong that the reviewers continue to characterize the subject in the same way that Chernow characterizes the subject, even when the evidence to the contrary is even in their review. And the other thing that Flatley brings up, and I'm glad that he did, is the methodology. You know, usually when you write a review of a history, you write an outline of the sources, the methodology, the historiography, and an outline of what the author was trying to prove and how they went about proving it. Most of the reviews of Hamilton don't do that. I don't know if this is because it's biography and not history, but Flatley writes, Chernow relies heavily on primary sources and previously unused volumes of Hamilton's writings. And this is good. It's good to round out your idea of somebody with new sources, good history. Good work there. And in the same vein, Kim Harris is going to tell us more about the tone and the intended audience. Brick is an ideal reader. This is a review for an audiobook. He is sufficiently dramatic and engages listeners when speaking of historical events, and he sounds more restrained when contending with the frequently florid passages. Brick projects a deep sympathy with Chernow's impassioned, partisan, and admiring prose for both high school students and history buffs. And with that due diligence, let's go back to historians talking about Hamilton. Joanne B. Freeman, whose historical works actually show up in the footnotes for Andrew Trees' review, writes, "This conversation is complex for historians, particularly for early American historians. Broadway's Hamilton is a fictional representation of a historicized past that comments on the present. It's a hybrid creation filled with inventions, omissions, and fantasies, yet inspired by a biography and pumped full of references to historical documents, events, and characters. There's a lot of history in Hamilton, and it's presented with enthusiasm, respect, and an appreciation of the historical craft, making it hard for historians to resist. More than once, Miranda has said that the secret sauce of the play is that he was learning and loving the period's history while writing. For some historians, that winning use of history is the play's biggest problem. Its fictions seem factual when mingled with historical facts, and there are many fictions. But the play's inaccuracies go deeper. It's for good reason that scholarly commentators have criticized the relative silence on slavery and gender and objected to its great man approach to the past. After decades of scholarship insisting that America wasn't founded by a handful of elite white men, some historians fear that Hamilton may set back the historiographical clock. They worry that by presenting the public with an infectious, upbeat, celebratory, founder-full version of history, the play may discourage people from grappling with America's far more complex and problematic past at the precise moment when reckoning with that past is needed. And this isn't the first time that Hamilton has been popular or that his image has been refurbished for modern times. He was very popular during and after the Civil War when his son wrote, if we'd just done what my dad said, we wouldn't be in this mess. He was also very popular in the 1920s because big banking was all the rage, and Hamilton was all about banks. And again, during the Cold War, when we've got this dichotomy between capitalism and communism, Hamilton is a great person to point to in our past and say, this is the American way, he was a prophet, he saw this coming. But now, a folk hero. It's a strange thing for Hamilton to be. He has certainly never been one before. The most unapologetically elitist of the nation's top-ranked founders, Hamilton was never a man of the people. Although it's worth noting that Hamilton didn't call the American people a great beast. That tin can was tied to Hamilton's reputation posthumously. Although he acknowledged the importance of popular politics in the new republic and actively appealed to the public and the press, he was never entirely comfortable with the politics of the street. He disliked the disorder of popular unrest, distrusted the impact of popular protest, and disdained wooing the masses. Worse, he rarely hesitated to say so. More than once, he yearned to march the army on political protesters. During the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion, his wish came true. He viewed his distrust of democracy as the height of responsible governance, a vital anchoring counterweight to the flighty whirlwind of democratic excess. Federalist's leading spirit, he virtually embodied this mentality, the gradual decline of both his reputation and his party in the early 19th century, revealing the degree to which he was swimming against the democratic tide. Yet they're new to most Americans, who tend to view the founding as a stream of inevitably happy endings. Of course Americans won the Revolution. Of course they wrote the Constitution. Of course it worked. Seen through that lens, the founders are little more than automatons doing their patriotic duty. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Chloe, doesn't this contradict what you said earlier about new history? If it's time for revolution, it's time for revolution. And I like the connection, let me tweak it. New history suggests that revolution and the move towards democracy were inevitable, whether or not Washington, Hamilton, Monroe, Jay, Livingston, Lee, Lawrence were all in the room when it happened. They were all replaceable. The conflict was inevitable. And this brings us into Sins of the Father territory because Andrew Trees says something very similar about Chernow's Hamilton. That said, Chernow provides us with the best portrait of the man himself, and that is no small matter for a founder who is so mercurial, charming, infuriating, brilliant, idiotic, and ultimately tragic. The book is less successful, though, at placing Hamilton in historical context. Although remarkably prophetic about what sort of country America would become, Hamilton was very much a figure of the 18th century. While someone like Franklin seems capable of being reinvented for every age, Hamilton is a more difficult challenge. So for a truly outstanding biography of the man, you need a sure grasp of his time, and it is here, unfortunately, that Chernow falls short. Chernow falls prey to the biographical trap of seeing history too much through the protagonist's eyes, so most of Hamilton's adversaries receive somewhat short shrift. This tends to diminish everyone involved, including Hamilton, as well as what they were fighting for. The political rhetoric of the 1790s was notoriously violent for a reason. The founders were struggling with profound questions about what sort of nation they were trying to create. Although it's easy to sneer at Jefferson's inability to understand Hamilton's financial plan, Hamilton himself was equally guilty of failing to understand popular politics in the New Republic. Most important, Chernow's uncertain grasp of Hamilton's time undermines the portrait of Hamilton himself. And that brings us back to the play. By emotionally engaging its audience, Hamilton pushes people past that stopping point. Now that brings us to an important question. We love Hamilton, but do we love Hamilton? Hamilton the musical tells the fictionalized story of a historicized character. That's a pretty far cry from the man himself. Billy G. Smith speculates on what Hamilton might have thought if he saw the play. However, Hamilton would have been dismayed at the sight of himself singing, dancing, and intermingling on a stage with so many common and ordinary people. Even though he lived a rags to riches story, he wanted desperately to separate himself from his past and from the rabble, as elite Americans referenced the lower and middle classes at the time. Hamilton the man would have been made socially uncomfortable by singers and dancers of the common sort. In political terms, Hamilton envisioned himself as a member of the wealthy, educated, rational part of humanity who should restrain the democratic leveling tendencies, Hamilton's term, that reverberated deeply during the era of American Revolution. Among the most well-known founding fathers, Hamilton was the most conservative, to the point of being reactionary. As the script glosses over, for example, Hamilton gave a 6-hour speech at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, advocating that the new nation should return to a monarchy, or at the very least, have a president and senate elected or appointed for life, after which the stunned delegates moved on to other business. Alexander Hamilton, the real person, is thus not a good fit for America today, either socially or politically, making it all the more surprising and impressive that the musical has garnered him so much favorable attention. Every character, or nearly every character in this play in real life, was white. In the play itself, only one character is played by a white actor, and that is King George III. So race is present, and it does play an important part in the storytelling, and it's very intentional in doing so. But what ramifications does that have in the larger narrative? Let's check it out. So for this portion, I'm going to be relying pretty heavily on Lyra Montiero's race-conscious casting and the erasure of Black past in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton, but there are lots of different points of view, and I'm going to be interspersing them throughout. One response to this casting choice is some pearl clutching. Ron Chernow's reaction to the play's casting is telling. I remember thinking, oh my goodness, they're all Black and Latino. What on earth is Lin-Manuel thinking? I sat down thinking to myself, I need to sit down and talk with Lin-Manuel alone. We're talking about the founding fathers of the United States. That incongruity is precisely what makes the play special to Diggs, who plays Thomas Jefferson in the Marquis de Lafayette, and says, I walked out of the show with a sense of ownership over American history. Part of it is seeing brown bodies play these people. And I know people who fall in this camp. My old boss said that seeing a Black George Washington was incredibly moving for her. And you know what? I can sympathize, because there was a time when reading Hamilton's love letter it meant the world to me. This idea that Black and brown people were not actually a part of this history is reflected in a line from a radio spot advertising the show, which declares, "This is the story of America then, told by America now." Others, including Chernow, have described the cast as representing Obama's America. The idea that this musical looks like America now, in contrast to then, however, is misleading and actively erases the presence and role of Black and brown people in revolutionary America, as well as before and since. America then did look like the people in this play if you look outside the halls of government. This has never been a white nation. The idea that the actors who are performing on stage represent newcomers to this country in any way is insulting. Miranda is Puerto Rican, meaning his parents and even his grandparents were born American citizens. The African American actors in this play may have ancestors that fought in the same Revolutionary War depicted on stage, and may also be the descendants of enslaved people on whose backs the founders built their fortunes and sustained their lifestyles. So I agree with this. But I'm also going to mention the flip side. Sometimes doing the history of slavery again and again can get fatiguing, and not just for white people who get tired of hearing about the blacks. You know, it's also the woman who goes to Colson Whitehead's reading of the Underground Railroad and asks halfway through the presentation if she can exchange the book for some of his others because she's just so tired of reading about slavery. So from this standpoint, it doesn't seem fair to say to the actors and the playwrights to say, you can play too, as long as you play the slaves. And I don't think that that's what she's saying, but I did want to throw that in there as a larger historical and interpretive phenomenon that we do see happening. And this issue is complicated further by the fact that the stories of our founders are some of the most precious ones in American history. You know, there's a reason why interpretation of slavery has been so spotty at founding fathers' homes. It's because they have these sterling reputations that people can't stand to see tarnished, even if they really weren't that sterling in the first place. And things have gotten better, but consider that we're still so precious about these stories that in the year of our Lord 2021, we're still having this conversation about whether BIPOC actors can play these roles. And then the last thing that I want to interject here before moving on is that you've got to be careful not to undermine the ability to tell stories of BIPOC historical characters. And the big bad in American history is always going to be slavery. But that doesn't mean that every story about Black history before the Civil War has to be defined by suffering. And it also doesn't have to define every story after the Civil War either. And you know what? If you really want to get into a conversation about historical representation of Black American history, let's talk about the fact that any depiction of Black Americans before like 1920 takes place in the South. You know there are Black people in all parts of this country, right? Get on it, New England. Chop, chop. This realization brings attention to a truly damning omission of the show. Despite the proliferation of Black and brown bodies on stage, not a single enslaved or free person of color exists as a character in this play. For the space of only a couple of bars, a chorus member assumes the role of Sally Hemings, but is recognizable as such only by those who catch Jefferson's reference to the enslaved woman with whom he had an ongoing sexual relationship. Unless one listens carefully to the lyrics, which do mention slavery a handful of times, one could easily assume that slavery did not exist in this world, and certainly not that it was an important part of the lives and livelihoods of the men who created this nation. Which, obviously it was, and larger than that, Black and brown people are important to the history of this country, even when they're left out of popular narratives like this one. And you know what? I keep hearing this conversation framed as, should we have Hamilton or should we have a story about BIPOC in American history? And I think this is a false dichotomy because I don't see why we can't have both. You know, we could also have better schools that teach things like media literacy and critical thinking and teach people not to learn their history from plays, but, you know, just a thought. So, to summarize, history is the study of the past. Biography is a character study of an individual. There are certain problems with the source material which do carry over to the musical. The play does focus on the founding figures to the exclusion of all other Americans. This in turn threatens to push back popular historiography of the late colonial, early Republic era. In making Hamilton relatable, there was a lot that was either changed or obscured about him, sometimes in obvious ways and sometimes in more insidious ones. And in casting cross-racially, a lot of important conversations about race in American history are obscured. That said, Hamilton's getting more people into history, and I think that's great. And it's important to have lots of really good roles for actors of color, especially ones that are so precious to our American story. But most importantly, we need to start prioritizing and telling the stories of Americans of color. We're at a place right now where it's cool to want to tell the stories of the Founding Fathers, and that's great. And you know, in 1790, they will always have been the highest status figures in the room. They don't also have to be the coolest figures in our history. They don't always have to suck up all the oxygen. And when they do need to be portrayed, I think that non-traditional casting is great. One of my favorite paintings is of the Last Supper reimagined as women. I think that sort of thing can be really powerful. So I'm not coming at this from not wanting BIPOC in white roles. I think it's fine, but I am saying that we need stories about BIPOC history, and the gimmick of this show and its popularity obscure the fact that we still don't have that. Here's an idea. If you want a musical about Black Revolution, you could do a story about the New Orleans slave revolt of 1811, which that story has it all. You know, we need to preserve and tell these stories as our own, as Americans. The founding politicians may have been white, but outside the halls of government, there were founding Americans of every race. And we don't need to stop there either. We can tell stories from outside of the strict construct of the US government. We can prioritize different historical happenings and different cultural touch points, and incorporate different characters and heroes, and put them at the center of the narrative, of their own narrative. We can make something that's new and old and great